Recently we were talking about maybe some things that had happened in the past at the Abbey, and it reminded me of how lucky we've been and how enriched our lives have been here by these Q&A sessions with the various um, outstanding, compassionate, wise masters that have come here, and how much we've all learned um, from that, um, from those encounters, from being with people who have practiced for so many years, who are following in these teachings, following the precepts. Yeah, it's just been a rare gift. And so let's take this as part of our training to help us to be able to benefit others most effectively by becoming Buddhas. And I'll ask the first question since I have the mic. I'm wondering if you would both talk about some of the most joyous and surprising or positive aspects of your monastic life.
When I look back and from the very initial time, the part about the whole of Buddhist practice, directly or indirectly having to deal with the mental afflictions, addressing that kind of, and then hearing masters from across the orders of Tibetan Buddhism, including the late Nyingma Master, Dunjom Rinpoche, very succinctly saying that the entirety of the Buddhist teaching is directly or indirectly, one way or the other, either directly or in a roundabout way, ultimately to address the afflictions at any particular level. And likewise, I have been hearing this, and then also through my studies, I've come across how one way or the other, including Vinaya, of course, Madhyamika, the Prajna Paramita studies, all of them kind of indirectly or directly seem to aim at addressing this problem of afflictions within us. Some go very deep into really finding locating the roots of them, even speaking of the very subtle latencies left by them, but some kind of deal with them on a grosser level, on a surface level, mainly their offshoots, the afflictions offshoots. I would usually think of afflictions as a poisonous tree with so many aspects of it that needs to be dealt with according to one's own capacities, be that the fruits of it, be that the branches of them, be that the root of it, the stem of it, the root of it, and even after having dealt with them, dealing with the subtle latencies, subtle traces of them, even though the root is totally gone. So hearing that and seeing that in the scriptures, and then through one's own practice, one's own experience, seeing how the entirety of the trouble starts from one's own mental afflictions, and how when you switch that and deal with situations in a more open and less susceptibility to the afflictions, it seems to change everything. And based on that, that seemed to give me a strong sense of confidence in the practice, as well as in the efficacy of the practice. And so there were times of sense of confidence that yes, this is an unfailing path, and this surely is something that can be verified through one's own examples, through one's own practices, little by little. And so there were occasions when that insight, we will call, or that understanding, assurance seems really bring in a deep-seated sense of confidence and be deep-seated sense of security against just about anything that one may come upon, kind of this confidence that yes, things may not come in a favorable way, but in terms of maintaining one's composure and even possibility of turning it around for a better thing, the key lies in you. And that the teaching, the multifaceted teaching, approaching it from so many ways, particularly Vinaya, really dealing on a, of course, its aim is at the root of the root of the negative actions, the root of the transgressions, whatnot. But it is a skillful means of kind of dealing with the outward fruits of them, and having the aim that yes, fruits could be plucked, but there's no end to it unless you address the problem. And so there you aim at it. And in one particular in individual affliction-driven negativities, also there's clear indication of how it can lead, it can point to the root source. So seeing that, and though one may not be able to actually right away address it, yet at the same time seeing it being linked there and how the possibility of dealing with that uh, is mentioned in the scriptures, and sometimes through one's own examples, practices can verify them. So that kept a deep-seated sense of confidence that one could carry around everywhere. So that seems to serve as an underlying source of joy and confidence, no matter what situation one may come across. And I very clearly remember this. I may have mentioned this last time also, but I very much clearly remember this when we were studying Dulva Vinaya, which at the great monasteries we study in terms of the expensive texts on Vinaya, uh, dealing with its root text, commentaries, whatnot. We do it at a later time, although the precepts are kind of introduced at the initial time, but we do not go into what we call what we might call the philosophy of ethics. There's so much in the Vinaya. It has philosophy uh, so expensive there. So studying there, I really remember occasions when I felt like, oh, the path to peace is here. The path to peace is here. And I remember having discussion with fellow classmates and who with whom we discussed about this, and they said that we do not need to make. We were discussing, and the discussion went to the direction of whether or not we need to make extra effort or let things just come. And so I was taking the side of yes, definitely we need to make efforts for that the Dharma could be met with us. But in terms of the strategy and the approaches, it's all laid out there. And that sense of yes, the path to peace is very, very much within the reach. Was one, I mean, several occasions very clearly, vividly felt when I was particularly studying Vinaya. So those might be called joyful.
Okay, so the question was about joyful and surprising or surprising. Um, First of all, I'd like to comment that how lively I feel that the Sangha is in this, very short few days that I observed. And that reminded me of when I joined the Sangha almost 30 years ago when it was a small Sangha. The Grandmaster just started. We have a few dozen monastics. And it was very dynamic and lively, and a lot of explorations, a lot of changes. Yeah, this sort of reminded me of that. And those were certainly joyous times. We feel like we're part of something great, part of something that will become great. So I will relate two stories. One joyous, another surprising. The joyous one was that when I began to study Buddhism on my own as a layperson, there was one particular sutra that was really interesting. It's the Surangama Sutra. But then nobody was studying it, nobody I know. So I had nobody to ask. It's a very deep and cryptic scripture at times. And so I struggle with it and struggle with it until I met the Grand Master who emphasized how important the Surangama Sutra is. And he said he will be teaching it in the Sangha. And I was so excited to hear that. So, yeah, I eventually joined Sangha, and then eventually, years later, I am in the community of hundreds of people that everybody wanted to learn the Surangama Sutra. Everybody wanted to study the Surangama Sutra, and I was able to teach the Surangama Sutra to the Sangha as well, and that's just a great joy. It's kind of like a dream that you had many years ago, and it just came true. From looking at this, wanting to understand this, and nobody else you can talk to being in an environment where everybody is studying the same thing. And that's a great joy. Another story of a surprising thing is how the Grandmaster can surprise us in our training. So this is a story. One of the earlier days, I was just a monk after maybe 2 years or 3 years, and the master was invited to give a public Dharma talk in a very large avenue. It was like thousands of people attending, and that was one of the first and biggest Dharma talks in Taiwan. So with thousands of people, and so we need to make a big impact. Such a rare opportunity, but we had no money. So with such a large stage, how do you decorate it? So then the Grandmaster decided we'll decorate it with monks. so there was no backdrop, nothing, no decoration. But then all the monastics, everybody, monks on one side and nuns on the other side, we all sat on the stage. But since we are a Chan monastery and we sit on stage, you had to sit cross-legged, right? Everybody had to sit cross-legged and not moving. Otherwise, we'll ruin the Grandmaster's reputation. But many of us are quite new, right? So he didn't care. And so we have maybe 50, 60 monks. That's how many we had at the time. So we all sit on the stage. And then he started to talk. And when he started talking, he doesn't care about anything else. And he talked for like 3 hours straight. So we were like struggling, really struggling. The legs hurt like hell, right? But you cannot really show it. So I was trying to inch it just a little bit by little bit. Hopefully nobody will see it. Eventually you release one leg, It's quite a struggle, and I wonder when the Grandmaster will finish. So that was a shock. But when you go through something like that, a really tough training, then a lot of training that comes later that is supposed to be hard becomes easy. Right, becomes easy. So we have many lay disciples who had never meditated anything longer than half an hour, and then we invite them to join the 7-day meditation retreat, which is like 70 sessions, right, in 7 days. And they are afraid. But then once you actually make the decision to go through with it, then you're no longer afraid of meditation. Right, so that's one thing that the Grandmaster was very good at training us with. Just add one thing. Yesterday at the rehearsal, where the new monks were to put on the robe and bow 12 times, and then another monastic was worried that they'll faint from the heat. But I observed that the Venerable Choja said, let them do it. They need a training. That's kind of what reminded me of the Grandmaster.
So, Venerables, both of you engage in translating the Dharma. So, I'm curious how the work of translation relates to your own spiritual practice. And is there a difference when a monastic translates versus lay people translating?
I have translated both secular and Dharma texts. And in both of these cases, particularly in the science translation, I very much clearly saw my ego attachment, attachment to the words that you come up with, and that's in Emory University. So the process is for us individually to focus on any particular text, or more particularly a discipline such as neuroscience, life science, physics, and mathematics, like that, philosophy of science. But then eventually we have to then table it for everyone to discuss about, particularly those technical terms that we are coming across for the first time, for which there is no consensus already reached from prior translation conferences. Then we have to table those technical terms, and then together with your one's own best shot after that point, which would have been worked out by the individuals. And then that's where it will be chopped. It will be discussed about and pulled this way and this way and this way. One could see when they are doing this, you can feel, you do not, you feel that yes, there is a connection between the word that you have come up with and your sense here, like that. So that was a very good eye opener to how attachment looks like. How in many cases they are, yes, that's the big shot. I mean, a big best thing that I have come up with, and that yes, everyone should be able to appreciate it. Whereas when it came to open discussion and it got chopped here and there and kind of proposed this way and that way, one could feel that. So that was just my individual experience. But in terms of translating text, it's not so much a distinction between whether a layperson is doing or a monastic is doing. It's more of a case of how much of a Dharma exposure they have, Dharma study they have, understanding they have, so that they could bring those contexts to bear on the translation, not just do it on the surface of it. So that part seemed to play a big role in the quality of the translation. Not just you kind of see that particular word or particular line in the context of the larger text itself, but in the context of the larger schema of the Buddhist teachings. And that seemed to make a big difference. So mostly it would be the monastics who would have had that kind of a training, and that could make a difference. But I personally think that it's more of a sense of how much of an exposure, immersion one has had up to that point into the Dharma, so that could be brought to bear on the translation, like that. And then in some cases, it's good to kind of take a step back and then look at it because in the course of translation, it is very possible that one could be lost in one's own cocoon and kind of really have a very narrow perspective to what you're translating, and that's how it shuts you out from all other insights one could bring in. And so that also is linked with what I was saying, that when one is kind of dealing with it with this awareness of this tendency of being so confined, so narrow, to kind of opening out, and then bringing in all other perspectives. That seems to make a big difference. So basically, I think that it is more of a exposure, and as well as one's own immersion into the practice, and how much one is kind of letting it sink in, and thus bring in that feeling aspect of the practice that makes a difference in how one translates, what terms you choose, whatnot. But my principle is, when one is translating, whatever target language one is translating, ultimately a native speaker of that language should have the upper hand in deciding the language. And so that, and yes, teamwork seems to be very important, and plus the final language should be handled by a native speaker. Although one could work together, but that seems to be, because when you are rendering it into a particular language, that native speaker would have more context in terms of what that kind of word, what you could brings out some nuances that you may not be completely, you may be completely oblivious about. So that part, language part of that, has to be handled by a native speaker. But then in terms of really bringing in the richness of the meaning, that is a Dharma text. There is this need of someone who is much more exposed across disciplines in terms of Buddhism, not just one particular science, if you will, but across disciplines, and also some amount of, to the extent you're capable of, some amount of integration into the practice, and that can bring in the big, impactful, significant input into the translation work.
A few points from my experience in leading a team to do translation of scriptures. One, you always have a main translator, the leader of the team, and he or she must make that decision, right? There's many choices, and somebody has to make that decision. So with every translation is gonna be different because the main translator is different. So for example, I led the team at Zhongtai Monastery to translate the text. And when I left, the person who took over, which was in my team, he took over, and I started modifying my translations, which you have to accept that it's not a right or wrong thing, but the personal style does definitely influence the translation, so we have to understand that. And another important thing, it definitely is a group effort. We look at the iterations. For example, the first thing we translated was Heart Sutra. Now it's very short, Heart Sutra, and there have already been a dozen translations in English already. But when we look at it, when I look at it from a Chinese perspective, because it is translated from Chinese, I'm just not happy with it. There's always something not quite there. So it took us 2 years actually to do that very short translation, and just many iterations. And that's true with the other efforts later on. If we look at the earlier iterations, oh my goodness, how terrible that was, right? But it just gets slightly better and better, until you give up. This is no perfection, right? At some point, you just give up. Say, okay, 85% or 90% good enough, because you're gonna be spending 10 times more effort, not sure making enough progress, right? That's another thing. And I think definitely it's important to have, for example, we translate to English, to have a native English speaker who is familiar with the culture, right, and context on the team. That would be very important. The main translator doesn't have to be that person. If that man translate is that person, that's great. But if not, as most of the time it's not, right? Have native speaker, native people who are born in America to be on the team, and that will be important because they will show you shades of using the language that we are not, we don't realize. And that's another thing that I find from, if you look at the English translations of Buddhist scriptures so far, a lot of it is by a single person, maybe a couple person. And when the source is Chinese, um, and they translate into English, no matter how good that scholar or that professor or that translator is with Chinese, you're gonna see some funny mistakes. That I know Chinese will interpret it this way, but they'll interpret it that way. And I'm sure we'll make that same mistake with the English, or Sanskrit or whatever. So that's why while most of the translations out there in English of the Buddhist scriptures, probably they're all pretty decent and maybe convey 80% or 70% or maybe even 85% of the of what it should be. Um, I feel that we can improve by editing it. Okay, by editing some of it. So there is not a never-ending task. But it's complicated, but then there's no better time to start than right now. You just have to start somewhere. Yeah, I think that's the main points. Oh, one more thing about the monastic translating or non-monastic. I think the important thing is that is the translator a practicing Buddhist? If the translator has many, many years of translation, that makes a big difference. That's another thing that I have problem with many of the translators. They are maybe scholars, maybe professor, maybe they just know Chinese, know the original language. But if they don't practice, they don't have experience with a deeper practice, there's gonna be some important, very subtle points that they miss. Because Buddhism is not just knowledge. There's a part of it, you can only go so far with intellectual understanding. There are beyond that, there's things you can only understand if you have experienced it, have practiced. So I do think it's really important to have a person who actually practices, who are serious about the practice, to be the main translator.
What does it mean to serve the teacher? And also, how does someone improve their ability to serve?
I don't know if there's a set of rules or standards to answer that question. I think what is really important is the desire the strong desire to make the teaching accessible or understood to your audience, to who you want to teach. And I think that is the main difference between people who are really good with the knowledge but are not good with teaching versus people who have the knowledge and who are good with teaching is constantly thinking about how to explain it, how to explain the Dharma in a way that people can understand better, and not to make it sound incredibly complicated, incredibly lofty, and incredibly well, yeah, I don't understand it, but he's very knowledgeable. That is not the point. Yeah. So the desire to make it to explain it in as simple sentences as possible while still conveying the essence. That is the challenge. But also there are many other aspects for example, teaching by action, right? Teaching by example. So the teacher must be mindful of guarding his own behavior, his own actions in, in, in other aspects than teaching. But from a student point of view, from the disciple point of view, if you see some aspect of the teacher who are not up to the standard that he's teaching, I think it's important to have the right attitude too, which is teachers are not perfect. Teachers are still aiming to become better and better, and if some particular behavior doesn't seem to live up to what he's teaching, or his or her teaching, we should focus on the teaching, what they say, what the teacher says. Is what they say beneficial to me? Is it the right dharma? Is it correct dharma according to the scriptures? That's what's important. Okay, instead of being very critical of that teacher's behavior. But certainly, being a teacher is, I think, is an aim of all of us monastics, because the reason we are monastics is to devote our life to the study, practice, and teaching of the Dharma so that it can be preserved. Without the Sangha to preserve the teaching, the Dharma would have died generations ago. So that is our job. But it doesn't mean that every monastic can teach, right? There are other monastic who support the teacher, and that's just as important.
I guess in terms of serving a teacher, I think to a great extent there can be general principles of how best one could do, where the main focus should be. Yet at the same time, it will depend on the capacity of the student in terms of what to focus on, something that he or she can make the most of. And this, although the ideal is to be able to serve someone in a way that every interaction becomes a lesson. And to that for that to happen, to a great extent, it depends. I would say, in the case of a student looking up to a student, to a teacher, it depends to a great extent to the openness, to the curiosity, to the to the openness, to the curiosity, to the desire to learn. And that way, when you have that desire to learn, then I think just about anything can sink in as a lesson in so many ways. And that way, with every passing day, it will become more and more joyful and be contributing to the enthusiasm of one's service to the teacher. But in terms of how and what ways one will receive that teaching or lesson will depend on will greatly depend on individual situation. We have instances of teacher who will be the same teacher but behaving very different to different students. And now it is up to the students to be able to absorb that. I've seen great masters who, in the company of one particular student, would be always scolding. And for them, the lesson is to really tolerate that. Not just tolerate that, to be able to look at that as a lesson. And it's very possible that even if you may not find any faults with you from that, but there's a lesson as to how you're going to handle it, how you're going to respond to it, what kind of good qualities you're going to bring up to it. It's not dependent on what the teacher says. It's how you bring it. what you bring up. So, so, so it will vary. It will vary. I remember very clearly one great master who had served as one of the teachers to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I mean, in a split second, he'll change with individuals that he may be coming upon. And that itself is a great lesson. You are looking from far, seeing, oh, now this student has gone, how is he behaving, this student, and you can see the pattern. And that clearly shows that that person or the teacher didn't mean to be mean, but there was a lesson to be learned that he or he may have seen to be fitting to the person. And so that way, as soon as you have entered into that kind of relationship through your own mutual understanding and agreement, once you are in that, then it's better off to be always looking for the good qualities. And that way, it would be always a lesson. But until then, until you have committed to that kind of a relationship, then you're open to kind of experiment and move from one teacher to the other. But once you have created that link, then it's far better off to make the most of it, which is possible. And that way, one really, be surprised and also be convinced that yes, Buddha's blessings, teachings, Bodhisattva's blessings, teachings, for us as students can only come through the door of the teacher. And that way, that will also serve as a booster, kind of a bolster to kind of commit to that once you have committed it, and also see how lessons are flowing to oneself. So basically, even from a teacher's point of view and also from the student's point of view, that kind of relationship is basically for spiritual growth. And in terms of how you do that, in terms of spending most of the time in serving the teacher, it will vary with individuals. One could be doing just this, the other could be always receiving teaching, or like that. It will be very different. But once one has committed to such a relationship, then it's far better off to be very mindful of the very basic fundamental purpose behind such a commitment and such a relationship.
How are you both preparing for death? How are you preparing for death? Personally, in your personal practice.
I don't think about it.
I have not died so far, so I will not die. It seems like I will be the only exception to live on and on and on.
Okay, maybe you feel I cheated. Well, think about when did we start dying? When we were born, right? Well, actually, before we were born, we started dying. So every moment we're living, but every moment we're dying. So living is dying. Or dying is living. When you die, do you perish? No. So it's just really any other moment. So if you fully live this moment, then you're ready when that moment comes. It's just a moment, you know. When the shock is over, you find out the mind is still there somewhere. You still had to go on. I just hope that we are mindful enough to know what we should be thinking. So in order to be mindful enough to go on when we are facing death or after we have died, it takes so much preparation when we are alive, so much training of mindfulness. So we have a saying, if you can be mindful on a scale of 10, then you can only be mindful when you sleep on a scale of 1. So if you get 10-degree mindfulness, you only got 10% of that left when you're sleeping. And then if you got 10 degrees of mindfulness when you are sleeping, you only got 1 degree of mindfulness when you are dying, right? So that means in order to face death, the most important thing is, what am I doing this moment? Am I mindful this moment? Am I sustaining my mindfulness this moment?
I guess this question doesn't pertain to me because I'm not going to die. Because I haven't died. Well, that's something to be in one's mind as a Buddhist practitioner, because very often we hear that the road to death kind of is a passage where your choices are narrowed down in terms of what kind of karma, among the wealth of karma you have, what gets picked up will be decided then. So that's why, as Master Jianhu was suggesting, one should be ideally prepared every moment, and so that at the time of death, when it happens, whenever it happens to be, one would be still hopefully able to stay mindful in terms of what choices to make, in terms of what kind of a mental state to bring up. So, so in that regard, as I mentioned in my previous sharings also, I think the recollection, the 6 recollections, is something to be made alive. The recollection of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, that of generosity, ethical conduct, and then the recollection or the remembrance that there are others who are witnessing, or in some iterations, the recollection of one's own samadhi practice. And so making that not just a one-time early morning remembrance, but to be able to off and on remember it through the day is very important, and that's what I'm trying. But then I'm also taking resort to a Vajrayana practice where I try going through, before going to sleep, I take up the practice of Chivachuko, transforming death into Dhammakaya. So kind of seeing the time of sleep to be a process leading to a similitude of a death state, and thus do the dissolution. And dissolution, I try to do it in a elaborate way. Elaborate in the sense that one is not bringing in deities, body mandala deities. The other one is filling them in the resolution. So, not that I'm good at it, but at least I know what the steps are, who the deities are, and what the inner signs are, and then try to go to sleep with the similitude of a clear light thought, immersed in my own take of what emptiness is, and then try to sleep in that. And then the next morning when you rise, you try to rise from where you slept in and come up. So that, I suppose, is a preparation for death, in that in the actual process of death, that kind of a practice of remembering what the steps are comes naturally. When it comes naturally, there is more chance of remembering recognizing what they are. Although when you do not die, you are not dead, or you're not actually dying in the process. You have to, what do you call? You have to, but yeah, simulate them. You have to deliberately simulate them and go through them. But the whole purpose behind that is to become familiar with it so much that when it happens naturally and you do not have to simulate, you'll be able to recognize it and thus be able to kind of prepare mentally for that. So that's the hope. But how much one has guarantee of succeeding in actual death time, there's no guarantee. But at least that's a step towards that. But the important thing is, lately I've also come to at least sense, like I shared last evening during the motivation, to make the habit of generating bodhicitta as often as possible and as elaborate as possible with the passing time, so that there may be a chance that on the whole the mind always remains within that mode of bodhicitta, and within that you'll be able to deal with the situations in an appropriate way, but kind of generally kind of conjoined with that. And that seems to hold yes, some hope in really making, if one succeeds at the time of death, really making a difference in being able to go through it in a much more positive state of mind.
So this is mostly a question for Venerable Master Jianhu, I think, because I'm wondering, I know how in our tradition we cultivate bodhicitta. We try to cultivate bodhicitta by setting the motivation before we do things, and for example, by remembering the kindness of all sentient beings and things like this. And I wonder, in your tradition, how do you go about that?
Cultivating the bodhicitta is also of crucial importance in Mahayana Buddhism, including Chinese Mahayana Buddhism. So there are many different ways to talk about it. My Shifu, Grandmaster Wei Jue, he presents a system which is taken from the Nagarjuna's Mahaprajna Paramita Shastra. There's a 5-step process. The first step is called bringing forth or generating the bodhicitta, 发心菩提. And that is the very first stage, which means that you make the commitment, you make the vow. I want to become a Buddha, and I want to liberate countless sentient beings. So, verbally, mentally, you make that commitment. So that is the first step. But that doesn't mean you are enlightened or anything. It doesn't mean how much Dharma you understand, right? You just say, okay, I'm inspired by the ideal, and I want to do it. So the second stage of the bodhicitta cultivation is called Fuxin Puti, or subduing the mind. Subduing, as in the Diamond Sutra, subduing your afflicted mind, subduing your penetrating your false views. I think you call it cognitive obscuration and afflictive obscuration, 见思惑. So you want to be able to penetrate that. You want to restrain your desires. Of course, after making that that vow or that commitment, I still have a lot of desires. I still have a lot of greed, anger, ignorance. So, but then that motivates you to do something about it, to refrain from doing certain things, and to be conscientious of your practice. So that is a long stage, subduing the mind, the conscious mind, and that will help your mind to become more clear, and so that you can actually learn the Dharma better, penetrate the Dharma, until you get to a point, the third stage. The third stage is called Mingxin Puti, or your mind is awakened. So 2 days ago, in my talk, we talk about the meaning of enlightenment. So in the Chinese tradition, we talk enlightenment, we mean awakening to the true nature, to your true nature. Not becoming a Buddha yet, but awakening to the true nature. And that is a crucial step. That's the third stage. That is when you truly understand the bodhicitta, what the bodhicitta means. What is the bodhicitta? What is the awakened mind? That's when you understand what is the awakened mind. What is the mind of the Buddha like? Okay, you got a peek of it. You understand the emptiness of the self. You understand the pure nature of what is ever present. You understand the difference between that and the discriminating conscious thoughts. Okay, so in Chan Buddhism, that is enlightenment. And the fourth stage is Fenzhen Puti, which means that from then on you can be considered a true bodhisattva. And from then on, you continue with the practice, you never regress. You continue with the practice and go through the 52 stages of the bodhisattva. You go to all the different stages until you become a Buddha. And when you become a Buddha, that's the ultimate bodhicitta. Only the Buddha has the ultimate bodhicitta, which is the unsurpassed, complete enlightenment. That is the real ultimate bodhi mind. So that's the fifth stage. This is one way to think about it. So in the second stage is really, so the first stage is, we encourage people to bring forth the bodhicitta, to make the bodhi resolve. And the second stage is what's really important, was, we do all kinds of practices, whether it's the satipatthana or it's the 6 paramitas, whether repentance or the chanting, the meditation, everything is for subduing the mind. So when you subdue your mind enough, the afflictions, the desires are shallower, and you have a chance to awaken your mind. Once you awaken your mind, the rest of it is you know what to do. Okay, that's one way we talk about it. But there are many different Buddhist schools, Chinese Buddhist school, like the Pure Land School and Tiantai School, and they will talk about it in a different way, and that will be a whole huge topic.
I'd like to invite both of you to think about the first 10 years of your ordained life and pick one challenge that arose. There's many, I'm sure. And how did you work through it? And what did you learn from it?
Strange, at this point, nothing stands out as a very, very big problem. I must have. Okay.
I think for the first 10 years, one of the biggest obstacles I had to overcome was how I was easily embarrassed. I just didn't want to embarrass myself. I was afraid to embarrass myself. So I would be careful to do the right thing, say the right words, and not to do anything silly, and to be a proper monk. But of course, that at the core, that is your own ego, right? So that took a long time. First of all, to realize it's my ego that's at the heart of it, and then to come to a point where I don't care that I did something silly, or somebody will be laughing at me for something, or somebody will misunderstand me. For example, quite early on in my monastic life, I was given a task to teach the other monastics. And then I would try to make my notes so elaborate, look so erudite, well referenced here and there and there, and then just wow everybody. But then after I came to, after I was able to see this fault and don't care anymore, or not a lot anymore, my teaching style changed. I try to make my teaching as simple as possible. I try to convey whatever concept there as simple as possible. I try to speak in a way even 10-year-old could understand, and that's a really good practice. And I don't really care whether somebody says, "Shifu, your teaching is so plain," and then we heard all this before. Before I would really care, and I would try to show them how how much I know. But then this goes back to what Venerable von Geshe was saying earlier. Teaching according to the capacity, right? To the capacity. What's important is what you're teaching. Does it help this person? Does it help that person? It's not to show how knowledgeable you are. So before, that teaching was centered on yourself, and later on, the teaching was, I can focus more on what that person needs to hear. That's a big change. And how is this process? How do I overcome that? I think, well, first of all, you want to be you want to reflect on yourself, right? You want to reflect on your own faults, and then know that you're not there, and then know that, try to see what attachment you have. And another important thing is the right teaching at the right time from your teacher. So that at a certain point, the Grandmaster pointed to me a text I need to study. So I was having a chance of a long solitary practice, so I had planned a set of scriptures that I want to study, the whole book list, And then the Grandmaster, I mean, I had told the story before. The Grandmaster came to my my cabin one day early on, and he asked me, "What am I doing? How am I practicing?" I told him I want to study this and then this and then this and this, and kind of proud. And the master said, "Are you studying the MPPS, the Mahaprajna Paramita Shastra, which is the Nagarjuna's magnum opus, right? You do have translations there. It's actually a pretty decent translation, maybe 85%, which is really good already. Anyway, so are you studying that?" I said, "Shifu, that's not on my book list." And so the master says, "Study that." I said, "Master, that has 100 chapters, right? Which chapter should I study?" He said, "From beginning to the end." And so a really good thing that I did was to throw away my book list and then just focus on that one scripture. And at a certain point, that was the break I needed to help me just contemplating really deeply. And I had the environment. I was alone, and I was meditating half the time and studying the MPPS half the time. And so I had the perfect environment for that. And I was able to think about it, really contemplate it, ABC, the absorb really deeply, and then focus on the conflicts I had. The conflict was, but this is in confliction with the Dharma that I understand. So the Nagarjuna was saying something that is contradiction to what I understand the Dharma should be. So when you encounter that in the scripture, that don't pass up that opportunity. That's when you have to find out why you are wrong and why the Dharma is, why the scripture is right. So I had that mindset, thankfully. And so I worked really, really hard, thought very deeply what's going on, how to reconcile my understanding with what Nagarjuna is teaching. And at some point, I had a breakthrough. And then at that point, I was in solitary retreat, or I thought, but the master putting another monk next door, so which caused a lot of ruckus, and that really bothered me a lot. But then, when I had that breakthrough understanding, the next day I began to appreciate him. I said, "Make as much noise as you want, because if I am understanding the Dharma correctly, it should not bother me at all." And it didn't. And then 3 days later, without visiting me, the Grandmaster took him away. So I was, oh my, this is amazing. Anyway, so the point was to study the Dharma and really have faith in the Dharma, and then work through to have real understanding.
I still have not managed to pinpoint one particular problem. Okay, but in general, yes, the three poisonous roots are the most problematic ones. And yes, I think I'll just share one story. I used to stammer quite a lot. Stammering was a problem with me. And this may not be completely connected with your question, but touches with Venerable Nawang's as well, little bit. So I would be very sensitive about it, and would feel very embarrassed, particularly when our main stay of study was debating, and you would rise up in the middle of everyone, and then you have a big point to make, and then that makes it even worse, right? Yes, I have something to bring in here, and then at the point of bringing out, you cannot speak, and that was very embarrassing, and I had to kind of live through it. It was very problematic, and somehow, little by little, I got to know myself better. How I'm worse in it, how I'm little worse in it, and I saw that being nervous seems to worsen it, and so I kind of slow myself down, and then kind of present it. And part of that is to also say that yes, you may be bringing something, but this may not be a big deal to others, because that was contributing to this nervousness also. And so it is quite clear that it was the ego, that I'll make a point, yes, like that. But then one day in the middle of the class, the teacher was leading us through through a lesson. Our classes are more like the teacher will lead us through the text we study itself is called general meaning. It's not, what do you call, tachu or final analysis, which we have to study on our own on that same topic in the room. But the teacher will really lead us through what is called the general meaning text of that particular discipline. So in the class, we will just let through general meaning, and even if we have questions and we raise it to the teacher will raise even more doubts and then leave it there for us to figure it out. He wouldn't spoon feed us with the answers. But we all love that, because that way we would be able to at least bring those questions in the debate courtyard and then see what the debating partners have to say, and then see what they have as a spiritual backing, reasoning, etc., etc. So in one class, the teacher singled me out and then asked a question, and I was struggling to answer it. And then the teacher said, "Look at him. What is he going through?" And because I had this regard for the teacher as my teacher, as someone to learn from, someone who is caring and loving, who he was all throughout. And I was taking it in a very positive light, saying, see, I have to really do something with this because others are concerned about it. And that made me double down on my effort in looking for how to deal with it. And that really helped. Somehow over time, without knowing when it did, it's kind of really slowed down. So otherwise, if it were to be somebody else, I would be very embarrassed and very hard, like that, very hard. Because there were occasions when initially in the debating courtyard, when we were debating Dharma, but we were angry. We were egoistic. We were even angry when somebody shoves you away and then like that. But then over time, we begin to learn that that's totally unbecoming of an behavior on you when you're supposed to be discussing Dharma, and Dharma has to have the right effect on you. Plus, the monks are so good in really pointing out when we make such blunders in the front of everyone. Everyone would kind of circle you and then kind of shame you. Oh, it would be such a big lesson. If only a single person were to single it out, you will be feeling kind of and what do you call it? Antagonistic, and then also thinking of kind of paying it back. But then when everybody is there, there's no way you can deal with them. You have to kind of, just as Maya Angelou says, if you cannot win, join the enemy. Yeah, you join with them and then laugh at yourself, and that's how the point kind of sunk in and then helped. So apart from the simmering thing, what I was saying is that if one has this perspective to someone as a teacher, as someone to learn from, and particularly that has been bolstered by your observation of their being kind, caring, knowledgeable, all of that, then it prepares you to kind of really see things in a positive light. And then the ideal thing is to eventually be able to bring it to everyone, so that you could see everyone in the light of being a teacher, not necessarily as your adopted spiritual teacher or your formal teacher, but as a way of learning from someone, no matter what they do. And that one picks up from one's one-to-one relationship and observation and training under a teacher. Yeah, so still I couldn't pinpoint one thing, but in general, the three poisons, and in particular, arrogance, ego.
So here we have the incredible opportunity to have almost a, uncountable number of books to read available, and almost an uncountable number of teachings, let alone those online. And then there's, the 300 and some acres of forest that we can work in, and all of the other offering service activities. How, in your monastic lives, have you worked with balance and with all of the opportunities to both benefit other sentient beings and work with your own minds and study and meditate? How have you maintained a balance, or even thought about it and approached it?
I don't think I found a balance yet. It's the ever struggle to try to, you either swing that way or swing that way, right? It's either teaching so much or being alone too much. So I think it's a constant trying to balance, and knowing that which way you're leaning too much, you bring yourself to the other way. So that's something you need to work on we need to work on for quite a while. Regarding there's so many Dharma books now that's accessible, just 100 years ago, or maybe 80 years ago, it wasn't the case. There's a Chinese master who had to walk hundreds of miles just to hand copy a sutra so that he could study it. But from my personal experience, I think it's really important to just focus on one particular sutra very deeply. You can certainly browse and read the other and study others, but there should be one that you really focus on. Okay? And for me, for the first 10, 15 years, it was the Surangama Sutra that I focused on. And then for the next few years, it was the MPPS that I focused on. And for the last 3 years, the Diamond Sutra became important, really important. And when you do that, when you spend a long period of time just so concentrated on understanding all aspects, you go beyond the general meaning. You go beyond the commentaries. You gain deep insight, and you know what? No matter which sutra, which scripture you start, I believe that they all lead. Eventually, everything connect together. You could start from the Chan perspective and study the Diamond Sutra or the Surangama, or you could start from the Prajna Paramita perspective. You could start from the Tathagata Garbha perspective. Whatever perspective, eventually all the teaching will come together, and that's the beauty of it. Wherever you start, you will, if you go deep enough, you will connect with everything else. And so don't worry where you should start, whatever that resonate with you, whatever you want to study, or whatever your teacher is teaching, and you want to focus on that, and that is the one but you really want to go deeper and deeper into, in one direction. And it is a challenge, because you do want to do bodhisattva work. You do want to, and I think you guys probably have a pretty good balance, I'm guessing, compared to what I was facing before. Because, when I was teaching in the Bay Area, it was like 365 days. The Zen Center is open. We have more than a dozen weekly classes every week. I was teaching half of them. The other monks are teaching half of them. And so finding time alone for 1 month, 2 months, it was hard. It was hard. I had to make a real effort to do that. Okay. I think the Venerable sort of shield you from that. And there's Dharma teaching almost every day on a persistent basis. And the schedule is kind of loose here, it seems. Which means that you have the opportunity to spend the other times, the open times, on something you need to work on. Whether it's meditation or the study or more helping with the Sangha. And that flexibility is good. It's quite American. But it also means that you have to make an effort, or you can slack off, right?
Yeah, given the situation that we have here, I think the best way of bringing balance is always be reminded of the motivation and bring it to play in whatever you do, so that yes, along with getting the work done, I want to be able to grow internally. Yeah, and then in the course of carrying out the chores and the works that one has, while bringing in motivation to bear on it to the extent possible, be also curious of where one's hurdles are, in where one is struggling to bring authenticity in it, and take note of them, and then bring it up during discussions, during teachings, and fill in those gaps during the teachings, one way or the other, through questions, discussions, like that. and that way it will fill in. In general, I agree with Venerable Sufu that it would be good to take one's time in focusing on one thing at a time and then kind of deepening it, so that that deepening will enrich and inform all the others that one will be studying. One will be bringing that same depth and then even deepening it further and expanding it like that. Otherwise, just going through the surface of one thing, one would struggle in kind of making the dots connect and also deepen things. But on the whole, I mean, there cannot be any better motivation than bodhicitta. But then it is not that easy. When you bring in bodhicitta to make it authentic, it has several aspects to struggle with. Is enlightenment possible? What does enlightenment look like? What does that mean in terms of developing the method aspect, the wisdom aspect? What does the stages look like? So one important thing to focus and keep in the sight of one's mind to fill in any opportunity one has is to really get a very clear idea of the roadmap and try to kind of not just be contented with a skeletal roadmap, but rather have that to begin with and then fill them in so that it would look like AA's map, roadmap with every station marked there. So that would be an aim and to work on, and then whatever gaps you find, you then bring that up in just about any discussion, and then kind of build on that. And that way, it will not only give one very clear idea of the road ahead, but at the same time will very convincingly strengthen one's bodhicitta motivation. When we say bodhicitta, it is such a layer, right? And that so many layers need to be taken care of for that to be very authentic. Coming down to renunciation, and then what is renunciation? What are the aspects that we struggle with that needed to be addressed so that it becomes a very strong one? Likewise, there's next steps like that. So we come across them in the teachings, in our sharings, whatnot, but use those opportunity in bringing them up for open discussion, in deepening it, and thus also look for the implications on others, and thus that way kind of build them.
Shufu, can you share the trick for the Surangama Sutra? I can never get past the 4th chapter.
You never get past the first or 4th. Well, I couldn't get through the 2nd chapter for a long time. Well, the trick really is in the 2nd chapter, 十番显见. It is in that passage in the 2nd chapter where the Buddha talk about, well, he uses 10 different ways to talk about the true mind, or leading you to the true mind. All right, so that is a really beautiful message. You really want to study that well. So if you can understand that passage, the 10 ways of showing the true mind, then you will have no problem with the rest of it. Okay. Before that, there is the 7 times where the Buddha asked Ananda, "Where is your mind?" So Ananda tried to answer it, and he answered 7 times. They're all wrong. That passage is pretty difficult to understand, but you can skip that because they are wrong. Do show the many different ways that ordinary people mistake their mind. So of course, you want to understand it, but what is important is what follows after that. And I don't think there's an easy way to explain it right now. It really takes quite a number of lectures. But it's such a beautiful, one of the most beautiful passages in all of the Tripitaka. How clever and how thoughtful and how skillful Buddha was in showing you the true mind. So you want to study that, really study that passage. And there's the levels, like when Geshe was talking about the levels of bodhicitta. There's levels of understanding toward the true mind. Yeah. Well, I'll do one. All right. In one of the 10 ways of Buddha demonstrating, he did this. Do we have a gong or a bell? So this is one of the things that the Buddha did there. Okay. Do you hear it? Do you hear it? Yeah, you hear it. Do you hear it? No, you don't hear it? What do you hear? Huh? You didn't hear it, all right. Let me try again. Is there sound? Yeah, there is sound. Is there sound? No sound. Okay, so I did this twice, and I asked the questions twice. Did I ask the same questions twice? No. What was the difference? Did you hear it? That was the first time, right? Second time it was there sound. Now, you know when there's sound and when there's no sound, right? So that's why you made a mistake when you answered the first time. Do you hear it? You say you do. Do you hear it? You do. You hear what? What do you hear? Absence of sound. You hear the absence of sound. And that's crucial, right? Because whether there's a sound or there's no sound, you do hear. The hearing is there. Sound is impermanent. But the hearing, the ability to recognize, to know whether there's sound or no sound, is ever present. What about when you sleep? Is that ability to hear is there? Yeah, it's there, isn't it? How do you know? Exactly. How is it that the alarm clock can wake you up? It's because even when you're in deep sleep, the ability to hear is ever present. I don't want to say permanent, as ever present. Every moment is there. So, look at everything in this world. Your body, your thoughts, your feelings, food, your clothes. Everything is impermanent. But the ability to hear or the ability to see, that's another demonstration in these 10 demonstrations, right? So there's light, so you can see us. Now, what happens when it's dark and there's no light, no lamp, no light? Can you see? What do you see? You see darkness, or you see the absence of light, right? So the ability to see is ever present. It doesn't come and go, right? So what about if you're blind? Let's say you got into an accident and then your eyes were destroyed. When you're blind, do you see? Yeah, you do. You see darkness. Your eyes can be destroyed, or light can come and go. The organ, the six senses, the six organ, the six ayataya's can be destroyed, right? But the ability to know via your eyes or ears or nose or tongue or body is ever present, isn't it? Now, what conditions make you able to hear the sound? Well, the striking, right? There's a gong, and the sound travels to your ears. Yeah. So all of the conditions make the hearing the sound of the gong happen. So that's a conditioned phenomena. But your ability to hear, to know that there is sound or there's no sound, what condition made that happen? Is it what? What is it? What condition made that happen? Made that possible? What condition produced the ability to know? What's that? No. Your consciousness. When you're deep sleep, there's no consciousness. Your consciousness is a product of eye seeing or ear hearing the sound. That's when the consciousness is the ear consciousness, and then the sixth consciousness arise, right? That is produced. That's a conditioned phenomena. What conditions produce your ability to know via your eyes or ear? You can't answer it because there isn't. There isn't. No conditions make that happen. So, remember 2 days ago, I talked about what is limitless merit. What is the infinite merit? How can there be infinite merit? Only if it is something that's already there. Unproduced, unconditioned. You can call it inherent, intrinsic. It's always been there. Uncaused. It's uncaused. You say, wait a minute, Shifu. What about when you die? Right? When you die, your body perishes, your conscious mind switch out, right? But the ability to know, it does not change because it is not the physical body that caused that to happen. It is not your parents giving you birth that caused it to happen. Now you say, how can I know that? Well, when you die, you will know. Trust me. No, don't trust me. Trust the Surangama Sutra. When you die, you will know. Your consciousness, your set of consciousness, now you have a set of consciousness that's of a human being, right? Well, depending on what rebirth you take, you may switch in a different set of consciousness. Depends on your alaya, right? Depends on your karma. But something that doesn't change with the consciousness is the ability to know. It's that knowing. It's the primordial knowing. It never goes away. It's uncaused and therefore it will not go away. That is the core of that Surangama Sutra. When you understand this, you will understand everything else.
The Surangama Sutra focuses on the because Anand actually had this sexual misconduct, and then this sutra came about. But in our precept, the first one is killing. So why is there a difference like that?
In the Mahayana precept, the first one is no sexual conduct. In the Theravada precept, or in the Shravaka precept, the first one is no killing. For the Mahayana precepts, the Bodhisattva precepts, the first one is no sexual conduct. That is most important. Okay.